Anyway, as Paolo said, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, these are the shows, these are the books I've done, sorry. Largely a big Doctor Who fan, any Doctor Who fans in the house. Really, we'll talk a little bit about the writing of that. It's quite a brilliant show, I think. These are most of the things I've done. Also love Torchwood, the spin-off, quite well done. I am the book review editor, so if you're master's students, when you graduate, you can email me, and if there's a book you'd like to have for free, because they don't pay you to write in journals, you can review the book, and I'll have it sent to you, so you can do that. And it's a credit for you, so it's a lovely thing. And written by magazines, the magazine, the Writers Guild. You can read this online for free if you go to writtenby.com. You go to the WGA, which is our website for the Writers Guild, and every 2 months or so it comes out. Always interviews with writers and showrunners, film writers, people like that. So it's really, I think, an excellent thing. It's like having a guest speaker come to you and very in-depth interviews, right? We'll talk about some of them that I have done over time. I do teach at Stevens College, which is located in Missouri, but we teach low residency, so they do everything online, but they come to Hollywood, which is where I live, for 10 days twice a year. And that's a lovely thing. And it's at the Jim Henson Studios, so there's Kermit saying hi to you when you come in. Very lovely and very welcoming to see Kermit every morning. I have a teaching philosophy, which is pretty simple. Words matter, writers matter, women writers matter. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. We haven't thought about women a lot over the years, and I do. One of the things I think we need to think about, this is a Facebook post that I saw the other day, and how words can be misused. So I don't want to get too political on you, and I'm coming from a place where there's a lot of politics going on, as you can imagine. But think about how these words were misused, right? Take a little second. Your brain will wrap around the mistake in these words. Think about it. You could have written that a different way, but they had an opinion they wanted to put out, right? So words are important. Likewise, writers are important. Writer comes before director when people are writer-directors, because writers are more important. You cannot direct nothing. You cannot direct some people walking around a room, right? Somebody has to say why they're there and what they're doing. So writers are very important. And women writers, well, this is one of my reasons why writers are important too. When you talk to friends about a movie you love, you do not generally say, remember the camera angle in scene 5. You say, remember the dialogue. You quote dialogue to your friends. That's the writer. That's why the writer is more important. That's why more people should want to be writers. Writers really matter. I think it's really true, the auteur theory, and I don't want to pick on the French, hopefully there's no one French in here, I'm picking on you, not my pie, you're looking at your French friend, right? Many people are now tearing down the auteur theory because it's ridiculous. The director is not the only person responsible for why a film works. It has always begun with a writer. Yes, it moves to a director, but that's a collaboration. And we made a mistake. Some people have written about the fact that in early days of film critique, critics couldn't go through 2 or 3 names of writers. So they went to the director's name because it was the only one person named. And slowly that became the idea of who the auteur was, right? It's not true. Vince Gilligan, very famous in America for Breaking Bad, really considered one of our best showrunners, one of our best television writers, pretty much says it, and I agree with him. Now, women writers have always mattered. They certainly matter to me, but we do not teach them very often. And that's a choice of the people who put classes together 50, 60, 80 years ago and didn't mention the women. So I mentioned them a lot. These are women that you should know. These are women from American film history. There are women in English film history, equally important. Hopefully you're having that covered in your classes. So, what happens with writers' rooms? Because this is the place where work gets done, where stories get told, created, honed in a particular way. At the very beginning, this is what everybody thought. This is a writer's room, because comedies did use them. Comedians were used to having 3 or 4 guys, generally always guys, who traveled with them and helped them make funnier jokes. In America, that was best seen in the Dick Van Dyke Show, which you can see on YouTube in many different ways. And Sally Rogers was the only woman anybody ever saw who wrote television, which was kind of shocking. But many women who came later defined her as a role model, because that told them they could get in a room someday, right, if they found the right kind of guys who would let them in. Neil Simon actually wrote about writing for Sid Caesar in a play, and that was all about glorifying what happened in the writer's room. So it's really a fun kind of play. If you see it around, I'd see it. I did some work on this TV show, which is from the 60s. It's also all on YouTube, if you care to see it. It was a comedy about 4 guys who ran a rock and roll band. They're literally still around and still touring. They're in New Zealand right now. That's how long-lasting the effect of the show was. But these folks were all the writers of it, including Treva Silverman, the woman up in the corner. She was the first woman to write alone on a series without a male partner, a husband or a guy who happened to work with her. That's a big move. It seems ridiculous, but that was a big moment in TV history. I wrote this article for Written By, which is about these writers, and it was very interesting to go back and speak to them in their 80s about what their experience had been to write hippie characters in the 60s. And it was all about how they shared stories. Some of them were more conservative, some of them were already becoming hippies. Treva tells a funny story about her mother not understanding what it meant when she said she smoked pot. Her mother thought she was doing something in the kitchen. She didn't divest her of that opinion. All right, so they all had a different attitude toward how they wrote. But in one-hour dramas, things were done differently back in the day, as everyone is fond of saying. They used writer pools. They would simply hire you under contract at a studio, Universal, Warner Brothers, Disney, whatever it was. And you literally sat around all day. Now that's a pool of women typing. That's how scripts were done before there were computers, right? They had a bunch of women in a room. They had that ditto paper, and you type and you get 3 copies with the little purple stuff. And think about that, you're doing that 24/7. If you're doing Gone with the Wind, how many copies of that script do you have to consistently keep typing so that it's ready? Yeah, a whole different world. But men, because they were mostly men, worked in writers' pools. So you got a contract with the studio to be a universal writer. And then people who ran different shows. So they'd be just like in England is today, one guy, again, generally a guy, who was in charge of the show. And that person would go into the writer's pool and say, who's free this week? I need an episode of. Generally, it was these kinds of shows. Columbo is still kind of famous today. The NBC Mystery Movie was like that. So they go and say, I need a Columbo. Who's got an idea? And somebody would raise their hand and go, I've got an idea. And then they would write next week's Columbo, right? So they were in a pool of writers. Out of that pool came these men who were icons of the 80s and early 90s. And it was because of their originality that they began to stand out. And I really can't stress that enough. This was a show in the 80s. It was my husband's favorite show. But Stephen Cannell, who I'm going to talk about briefly in a second, he was in the writer's pool. And he was asked to write an episode of this one day. And the reason he stood out and became then his own showrunner was because he had the craziest little idea. Rather than worry about what's the crime this week and what's the problem the cops are involved with, he just thought, what would happen if the police were assigned to work in a police car which kept breaking down all day? Just a funny little idea, which then was the theme of the whole episode. How do you do your job when you're not provided the proper equipment? And that made other people in Universal buzz about this new cool writer, and they pretty much thought he had a particular voice. And to me, that's the most important thing, and you hear this word 1,000 times. What does it mean? How do you do it? What does it prove? I'm going to make you do a little exercise practicing that, because writer's voice is style plus opinion. You have a style of writing, and you have something to say, right? That's the theme. If you don't have a theme, you have no reason to write anything. Everything that's written, that's remembered, is because you learned something while you were watching it. It might be that friends matter, which is really the theme of all of the Harry Potter movies, let's admit it. That's all you learned from those movies. They were quite fun, but that's a pretty good theme in life. Friends matter. Themes are universal. So this is my opinion, but I think generally speaking, people find this the opinion. So what I want you. All right. So what I want you to do for about half a minute is describe this woman. Visually, describe this character. Her name's Erin Brockovich. You may or may not have seen this movie. All right. So you might know something about her from the movie, but visually, and she's Julie Roberts, you can tell. Quickly, how would you describe her if you were writing that action line in your script?
How much time do we have?
Like half a minute.
Going down, guys.
Nah, think about it. I'm gonna hear a couple of them. You're like, I don't know. You should tell me to be homework. Think about how you would describe her. If nothing else, think of 3 adjectives. We always start with that. Style comes from what you do in the action lines, because the dialogue has to sound like your characters, but the action lines sound like you, all right? Think Thank you. You're typing. Tick tock, tick tock. One sentence. Who's got a sentence that describes what they see on the screen? Someone's going to volunteer. I'm going to point to somebody, and that's just so rude. Who's got something? I will. I see some hands moving. That's a lovely thing. You can hear the little tiny bit of typing. All right, who's got some? Shy doesn't work in the writer's room. If you don't have an idea, I'll stop paying you a contract and you go home now. I always tell my students when they have to pitch, you better have an idea right away because you're turning down $38,000. Because if there's a new script and we need one done next week and you don't do it, your friend just got that much money. That's a lot of money to turn down because you're too shy to open your mouth. So school is when you practice not being shy. Who's got some? Fine, if you're all don't be shy about it. Someone will have to share with me later. I'll share with you what Susanna Grant wrote. That's style. Can you see a distinctive writer's voice there? That's a person with an opinion who's giving it to you in the way they describe their character. And I know who that character is now. I know so much about her, I'm interested in following her. That's a really cool character description. You could do the same for her boyfriend, but I won't make you. This is what Susanna Grant wrote. It's a beautiful way to describe him. I want to go out with that guy, right? That's an interesting guy. He's much more than just what the picture can tell you, right? So style is an important thing. Style makes you stand out. This is Susanna Grant very briefly. We're not doing movies, but you know, whenever I talk about a writer, I think you should know that writer. If you don't, you should check her out. She wrote a bunch of movies you've seen, but you might not know who wrote those movies. It's my goal that when people leave a master's program, they don't just know who directed their favorite movies, they know who wrote them. That's the important person, especially in a writing program. All right, so back to where I was going. These guys, the writer-producers. And again, they were mostly guys in the 80s and early 90s, right? Mostly guys. I did a big article on these gentlemen as well because I had once worked for Kenny Johnson, who's a marvelous man, in the corner with the Incredible Hulk. He did the first TV superhero, which was the Incredible Hulk show back in the day. So all these guys came out of the Universal Writers Pool, right? Stephen Campbell was so beloved that when he died, he was not running a show called Castle, which ran for 9 years on network television. But the people who ran that show had been trained by him. And when he died, the ending of their program, they ran this logo, which was how his TV shows in the 70s and 80s used to end. And in honor of him, they ran this and called him a colleague, a mentor, and a friend. That's a big deal in Hollywood, where mostly we say nasty things about people. So it tells you something about his personality. Likewise, we have Stephen Bosco, who really started the idea of multiplicity in storylines in Hill Street Blues, which is a very famous show. We have Dick Wolf, who gave us the Law & Order franchise. That was on for 19 years, didn't quite make 20. This show's made 21. I saw it just airing on Sky TV the other night, so it's something available in Britain. And of course, there was a British version of Law & Order. They actually did one where they took early scripts and they transferred them here. Didn't do great, but what do you know. Don Belisario gave us basically military heroes, which are pretty big in the States. But he himself had been in the military during the Vietnam War, and so he came out. People may not know it, but the Magnum story was that, right? He was a Vietnam War vet, and then as Belisario moved through it. And these shows all ran a good 10 years apiece. So, long-running programming. Kenny Johnson's guy I worked for as an assistant. He invented The Bionic Woman, again, writer's voice. He was on staff at Universal. They came in one day and they said, hey, we're doing the $6 Million Man, we need a storyline. And he said, which is a nice tip, know the classics. We fall back on classics all the time. Sons of Anarchy is Hamlet on motorcycles. That's how they got pitched, right? Empire is King Lear in a rap record recording studio. Seriously, knowing Shakespeare does you well in life, I promise you. The Bionic Woman, that's the Bride of Frankenstein. He walked in the room and said, you've created Frankenstein, why doesn't he have a bride? Right? And better than that, she was the last episode of the first season of this show, and the studio killed her so that there'd be a great tragic ending. And Kenny, who was a young writer then, said, this is like the middle of the second wave of the feminist movement. You can't kill the most engaging woman that you have had on your program. And the network said, yes, we can. Nobody wants a love interest for the lead character because women want to imagine he'll fall in love with them. And they don't want to get in some other girl's way. That's rude, right? So they killed her. And the mail, because there wasn't yet email, that they got complaining that they had the audacity to kill the most accomplished woman who had ever appeared on that show meant that miraculously, at the beginning of season 2, she wasn't actually dead. They had bionically saved her, and then she got her own program. And Kenny became an executive producer of his own program because of his creativity. Because he had come up with that character, he now owned that character. And he moved into The Incredible Hulk, really the first superhero show on TV that ever survived. And then he did V, which was redone a few years ago, and then he did Alienation, which is where I met him and worked on that show. But in all these early drama rooms, there's something missing. Who's not in that picture?
Any woman.
Thank you. There you go. That's a problem, because most all these stories are being funneled through the minds of guys. And you can't blame a person for writing about what they know and what means something to them. That's what writers do. And that's why a room wants as much inclusivity as possible, right? So we don't have any girls. I got beloved chance to interview Russell Davies. He came to the States to do the 4th season of Torchwood, and the editor written by knew how much I love Doctor Who. So he asked me if I'd like to interview him, which I did. And this was something that he said to me that meant a lot. Again, you probably know he's an openly gay man. And it bothered him what he was seeing on television. So obviously he invented Queer as Folk, and from that he revived Doctor Who, and invented Torchwood, which allowed us Captain Jack, who's just so adorable, I can't stand it. But not on my team, so there you go. So this is really important. He was recognizing that in what he was creating for television, and again, made the programming more inclusive. This book here, I highly recommend if you like Doctor Who, but if you like writing, Benjamin Cook, the writer, the journalist, asked Russell Davies in the last season of David Tennant's era, could I email you across this year and just ask you questions like, what are you thinking of today? And Russell was like, sure. And so it's the collection of their emails as he wrote the last season. So you'll start with something like, well, today I'm thinking, what if water was deadly? I don't know what to do with that, but that's on my brain today. And a few weeks later it was, what if some astronauts were on Mars and Martian water was deadly? And by the time you were done, we have an episode called Waters with Mars, right? So he watched the progress and development of the story through these emails with Russell Davies. So, quite a brilliant book, I suggest. Now, lack of women, ta-da, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Thank God. Although we've discovered in the States that Joss Whedon, who ran the show and got all kinds of points for being a feminist, was in fact having sex with every other girl he could meet, so apparently not such a feminist. His wife has now left him, ta-da. But I, academically, am going to interpret to you that the reason the program maintained its level of feminist theory was because of all the women who he hired in his writer's room. So perhaps subconsciously he knew he was a jerk and he wasn't going to interpret this right, and he wanted to get a room full of people who could give him a real interpretation of what it was like to be a girl in high school who was othered, who was different in this way. So Buffy is a pretty breakthrough, and I highly recommend that show. It's free now on Amazon Watch. If anybody cares, the whole 8 seasons are there. Still, there's something missing in writers' rooms in America. There's some girls in that picture because it's executive produced by a girl. Missing something else. Yes.
People of color.
People of color, because, you know, they exist in the world. Isn't that interesting? But they were not yet existing on very many TV shows. Again, a whole font of stories not being told correctly. On my show, Touch by an Angel, we had 2 women of color. And you have to remember that you only have experiences until you do research that come from your own life. And that's good, and that's a building block, but it's not everything, right? So, for instance, we were doing a story once about a young little girl. She was 9 years old. She happened to be a young girl of color. She was lost at a park or something like that. And, you know, the first thing that came to us, what do we do next in the story? Well, she's going to go find a policeman. And the 2 African-American women in our room went, oh, no, she's not. My parents told me never to go to a policeman. And we were like, but I was always told to find a policeman if I got lost somewhere. Yeah, because you're not a woman of color, so you can be safe with them. That was a whole new perspective, right? A perspective that I would not have had I not had that other voice in the room. So, one of the big things about writers' rooms these days is being as inclusive as we can be. You guys are better at that. I'm always impressed with British shows because it's always kind of a mix of people, well, always, the ones that I get to see in America, all right? But that's impressive to me, and of course we all know, we went so far as to make the Doctor a woman. That's huge. At least that was huge news in the States. I don't know if it was huge news here, but we were very happy about that. So, finally from the 90s and beyond, we're getting more inclusive writing rooms, right? But you might notice we don't yet have too many Asian American writers. I mean, there's a lot of ethnicities not completely being represented, but producers are more responsible to that idea now because they recognize it makes the product better. Because a collaboration of many ideas is always going to be a more layered piece that you're presenting. So, the thing about writers' rooms is they had to evolve over time, right? I was interesting to watch them grow. So these are a couple of, empires, as I mentioned the other day. The new thing is that video game writers are using writers' rooms. And that's huge. These gentlemen, Ralph and George, are with Blizzard, so if you know Overwatch, right, and Diablo and those things. They came out of television. They were hired by the video game companies. They're now looking for television writers because they want people who understand how a writer's room works. And they were explaining that their writer's room, most writer's rooms now, 5-6 people. Theirs go to 10 or 12 because they've got guys who are lore experts who are going to remind you of what this character did 15 years ago with his stepsister from the other kingdom, whatever that is. They have to have people who are storyboard artists who are going to show you what the new characters look like, what their weaponry looks like. They have the historians who tell you what else should be happening in this village at this time. They have a giant room full of people, plus about 5 or 6 writers who are doing the storylines for these characters. So it's really a brilliant thing to be part of. So this is a great hashtag. Show Us Your Room is a challenge the Writers Guild put out to get more people to have inclusive writers' rooms. So of course it's up on Twitter, and anyone who has a writer's room with people of color or people of different backgrounds, ageism is a thing in Hollywood too, so there's some of that. They're putting their rooms up there, and people who haven't put their rooms up there is because they noticed they haven't done anything different, right? So it's kind of fun. So let's think about what happens inside a writer's room. By the way, that's not a bad book right there. Couple of really important showrunners in America right now and what they have to say about it, right? Nausicaa Khan is fresh off the boat. I don't know if that's in England or not. It's the story of an Asian American family immigrating to the United States. It was based on a famous chef in New York. He wrote a memoir. Now they turned it into a TV show. It's a comedy. It's quite fun. And so obviously she came in and she wanted people who were different. She was smart enough to know she needed people who understood being on the outside looking in, because the theme of the show was how do you assimilate without losing the heritage you came in with. That's the big question, right? So it's a really important new show. It's about the 3rd season now. But, did I go too fast? Yeah, yes. All right, Bruce Miller is running Handmaid's Tale. And there's a whole lot of question about that. He's the guy who's running the Handmaid's Tale. But he had the best take on the story. One of the things people will tell you in writing is to write what you know, and you think that means write the experiences you've had. But you can't just write that or you'll be done, right? So that's where research comes in. So what do you actually know? What you know are the emotions you've had in your life. That's what you know. And anyone can recognize emotions of abandonment and fear and loneliness and all those things. And Bruce Miller happened to come up with the best version of the pilot based on this novel of all the other people that they brought in. And I think that writing what you know emotionally is an important thing to think about because you have to be comfortable doing that to be a writer. Tennessee Williams, who's a famous American playwright, once said that writers write from the emotions of the first 6 years of their lives. which I kind of thought was like, how do you make that up? And then I looked back at a bunch of scripts I've written in my life, and I have this recurrent theme, which is telling men that they should be good fathers, that having a child doesn't make you a man, raising a child makes you a man. I've used that line several times, accidentally, in different scripts. My dad left when I was 6. So either Tennessee Williams was right, or that's a nice coincidence. I don't know. But that's an important thing to remember. You don't just have to write the history of the life you've led. It's the history of the emotions you've led. That can bring you anywhere, right? Because J.K. Rowling didn't go to Hogwarts. She doesn't do magic. But she understood being lonely as a child, right? That's the most important thing tied into. Now, of course, I just mentioned Vince Gilligan. Also, very important about a room, it has to be a safe place. People can talk. People can be open about their experiences so that you get the raw honesty going on that people build off of, right? But we have to check it out. Safe, but open. There was a huge lawsuit in the United States, in Hollywood. The writer's assistant on Friends, which everyone knows because everyone's seen Friends a million times, she sued them for harassment because in her job of listening to them talk, of course they talked a lot about their raw sexual experiences. That's kind of what Friends was about, although you didn't really see that part of it, right? You got to it was more soft. And she was embarrassed. But she knew she was getting a job on a sitcom where that kind of thing was going to be discussed. So, kind of a mess, because that is the job, but then you have to be gentle about how you're doing that and recognize who's in the room and think about how you honorably discuss these things. It wasn't really part of how people behaved a few years ago. So that's a delicate balance that a writer, producer is trying to create in their room. You need to tell me. First day on one of my jobs, to introduce all the writers to each other, everyone had to tell the story of how they lost their virginity. Yeah, to a bunch of strangers. Yeah. And I had a partner then, and I knew she lied because I knew her real story. So that was interesting. It was like, no, don't lie. Don't start off by lying. That's a bad idea, right? But she did, so that told me something about why we weren't partners a few years after that. All right. On Orville, I don't know if this is transferred to England yet, but it's, who's seen Galaxy Quest? Alan Rick, I love Galaxy Quest. That is a movie that is survived by the writing. It could have been a silly piece of nonsense that was just a couple of gags strung together. But the story is so strong, the movie is actually really good, and Alan Rickman is, of course, always wonderful. But Seth MacFarlane talks about this idea. You have to tell the stories of your life. You stumble upon things by saying this happened and that happened, or I had a friend to whom this happened, right? One of my early episodes of Touched by an Angel had to do with a couple who was having a baby, and they found out it was going to have Down syndrome. And then they had to make the decision, were they capable of being the parents of a handicapped child? And of course there was the moment where they could have chosen abortion. They did not, but they had that discussion, right? Because drama is built around making a choice. And that's probably the biggest choice a person could ever make, right? So that was built on the fact that somebody in the room one day, that was happening in their cousin's family. And they were talking about it and how they'd been on the phone with them. And we thought, oh my gosh, that's an excellent story to try to move into. And what are the possible reasons you would make this choice? What are the reasons you would be talked out of making this choice? How do you deal with that problem? It just came up in personal conversation. So being a good conversationalist makes you a good writer, because you can tell stories about your life and your friends' lives. Roberto Aguirre Sacasa is in charge of Riverdale. Is that here yet? Based on the Archie comics, which is kind of funny. First season, pretty good. Second season, getting a little sillier. Third season, getting a little sillier. I know, Shayda, not very good. But the idea that a writer's room is like a dinner party, and you're just kibitzing with people and having a good conversation. And from that, people go, oh wait, I like that, and I like what you said, I'm going to put all these things together, and we're going to end up with a story which we all like. Love Tina Fey. Tina Fey is a great example of going from acting, because of the strength of her writing, becoming the first woman to run the evening report, the weekend report on SNL. Then, of course, she did Mean Girls. She got hired from her comic chops to write Mean Girls. You may or may not know that was recently nominated for a Tony because she turned it into a Broadway show. Writers own the product throughout all of its lifespan. Directors do not, right? The director of the movie Mean Girls was not invited to direct the musical, but she was invited to write it. So writing is powerful. So her and her husband, Robert Carlock is her husband, so they've worked the last 2 TV shows together. And that's their opinion. Again, diversity in the room with lots of things. Even educational status is an important thing that makes it different. Terrence on Book Empire, he came off of The Sopranos. So he had a very good pedigree, then he moved into Boardwalk Empire, and the idea of how you parse out the story. And this comes from structure. At what point do you give out what information? How do you string the audience along? I think that's really interesting. That's a whole nother conversation. And Margaret Nagle came off of Boardwalk Empire. She's a pretty brilliant writer in many ways. She started her career, she was an actress. She moved into writing, and she knew she needed to write something powerful and different. You've got to find something that hasn't been done a million times before. And Warm Springs was the story of Franklin Roosevelt and the time he spent at a spa when he had polio. We've seen a million Franklin Roosevelt stories in America because he's one of our big heroes, right? We've seen the relationship with Eleanor, we've seen the relationship with his mistress, we've seen World War II in any different way you can figure it out. Nobody had done the story of how a rich boy dealt with being diagnosed with polio. What did he do and how did he survive? And it was in this spa full of other people who weren't famous or rich. And he had to meet people he had never met in his normal life. And that's what formed the man who became the president, who created all the programs that helped us survive the Depression and the war. And so that was a brilliant idea for us. And it was just reading history. And she stumbled on that and thought, why have I never seen this story? I'll write it. What a lovely idea. Reading history is a brilliant thing to do. Hello, Lin-Manuel Miranda. Have you seen Hamilton? Probably not as big here since it's about us beating you, but still. He was reading a book on the beach during his summer vacation, and he got a Broadway musical out of it. And he's, done pretty well with that. He just made $14 million from Puerto Rico by taking the show to Puerto Rico. So that's a big deal off reading a book one summer, right? One piece of history. She then moved into running a show called Red Band Society, which only ran for one season. And that's a whole other conversation, but I wanted to mention it briefly because tone is something that we try to teach, but it's very difficult. It's almost as difficult as style. But if you go online, which you can on YouTube, and look for the theme song, the opening to this show, Braccialetti Rossi, which was done in Italy, they're both adaptations of a book. This show is so beautiful and magic and lovable, and you just want to be with these children in their terminal ill part of this hospital, and everybody's wonderful. In this show, the opening shows what huge jerks every one of these children was before they got struck down with their disease. So I don't really care if they die. The tone is all wrong. I need to love them and root for them, and I find them being mean to each other. The one girl is this awful cheerleader who's just, and then she dies. So, she's the tone wrong, which fascinates me, because when you are well practiced, you don't think that's going to happen. But, that's another story. Anyway, it comes down to what happens in a room. So, Touched by an Angel I spent a lot of time on. I actually started my career as a high school teacher at an all-girl academy, which is funny because now I teach at an all-girl college. And then I was a receptionist, and then a writer's assistant. So these are the stages of how you get into a writer's room. Either you have to have a friend who's a writer, or you get an agent, which is almost nearly impossible without having a job already. Or you become the friend to writers by getting a job working for them in some fashion. I actually know someone who got a job because he was the ski instructor to the writer's wife. And he gave the wife a script, which she gave her husband, and he liked it enough, he hired the ski instructor to be a writer on his show. So however you can get in the face of writers is an important thing. That's what internships are very good at. That's what interviewing people, if you have a school newspaper or someplace you can get published with something, or a blog, and you offer to interview someone, you can make an introduction. That's really an important thing. So I went through these are a bunch of shows I was an assistant on. Then I was a freelance writer, which is what we do in LA. And then I was hired full-time on Touched by an Angel. So let me talk briefly about the kinds of things you learn in a room. One of the things you should take a class in is psychology. Because reading other people and managing how you deal with them when you figure out their personalities either love you or don't love you, but you have to work with them for the next 3 years because contracts are 3 years long. So you have to work around them. In this particular case, we were doing an episode about a gentleman, sadly, who was dying of AIDS and coming home for Christmas to tell his parents that he was both gay and dying of AIDS. And what happened was the writer who was doing it was very fond of himself and didn't like to be told anything was wrong with his stories. But your job in the room is to make all the stories as good as possible, because if the show gets canceled, you all lose your job. So I knew that he didn't like criticism, and he was higher on the hierarchy than I was, right? He was a higher rate producer. I was still a co-editor or something like that at the time. And I'm sitting in the room, and his problem was, this is a story about angels who came into your life and told you how you were messing it up, and please fix it. So the father was a violin maker, and he was going to give his son a violin he'd been working on since the boy was born. So that's about 26 years. And it was still not good. And he really wanted to give the kid the violin because there was a metaphor of if he played the violin again, maybe he wouldn't be gay. I'm not really sure I agree with that, but anyway. There was this violin. And I kept sitting in the room thinking, it took 26 years to make this violin, and it's really important you give it to the kid soon. Throw it away and make a new one. Something's wrong with the wood. Right? So I said, this is my problem is, and he said, oh, I'll fix the problem. The angel will have given this guy the wood, and therefore he can't throw it away. Right? It's like, well, 26 years into making this violin, the angel gave me a crap piece of wood, okay? I need to start again. I need a reason why you can't throw this piece of wood away. And it's a Christmas episode. There's only one piece of wood an angel can give me that I won't throw away on Christmas Eve. What is that? Where am I going to find a piece of wood on Christmas Eve that only an angel can deliver, that I can't throw in the trash? Writers.
Christmas tree?
Close. That was the first thought, Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is not spiritual. It's not connected to the Christmas story.
Cross of Jesus.
Cross is close, but that's Easter. That's Easter, but you're close. What involves wood and Jesus and Mary and Joseph?
The manger.
Thank you! So, I got the idea while I was sitting around the table with everybody, but I knew this guy didn't like to be one-upped, and I didn't want him on my bad side, because he helped sign my contract later, right? I'm like, but I gotta get this idea out there, but I can't pretend to be smarter than him, because that will not make him happy. So I sit there at a table of like 10 people, and I got the idea. And I thought, well, luckily I'm a pretty loud person. I'm considered Italian where I come from, but clearly not here. As my grandparents are from Sicily. So, all of a sudden I just went, not the whole table, but the guy sitting next to me went, what? And that's all they needed was someone to ask me what I was thinking, right? So I was like, I've been thinking about this problem, and I had this idea, but I don't know if you'll like it. Oh, what's your idea? Well, what if the wood came from the manger? And like 4 people around the table went, oh, yes! And the guy who wrote the story was about to say no. I could see his face. But when his colleagues all went, yes, he was like, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. We should, okay, that's what we'll do. And so I wasn't one-upping him. I was just accidentally having a moment. And it allowed me to get my idea out. And that sounds ridiculous. But I got what I wanted out of it, right? So you have to learn to read the room. How is it operating? Who are your allies in the room? This other episode, it's called Smokescreen, had to do with an African-American executive at a tobacco company who, of course, has to deal with the fact that he's selling a product that kills people. There was going to be a lawsuit, and originally we have 2 angels. One was Roma Downey, who comes from Ireland, who's an Irish woman, and one was Della Reese, who's a famous jazz singer, who's a woman of color. We always made the angels real people in people's lives, and that's how they got to talk to you and try to, they never told you they were angels till the very end when everything would, they could get you to change your mind. So the very first thing, because people fall back on stereotypes all the time, it is far too easy to go to the stereotype, and you have to learn to go beyond it. So they were going to make Roma Downey the lawyer, the guest lawyer, and Della Reese the guest maid in this family. And one of my best friends, this is a terrible phrase from Seinfeld, happens to be African-American, right? She's not my only African-American friend, but my best friend. And I knew she would cringe if Della Reese played a maid. So I raised my little hand and I said, wouldn't it be cool if Della was the lawyer and Roma was the maid? And to their credit, everybody in the room was kind of like, oh, duh, yeah, why didn't we think of that? Okay. But a production problem. Della Reese was actually a minister in a church in Los Angeles, and we filmed this in Utah. So she was given every Friday to fly back to LA to run her church for the weekend, and then she'd come back Monday morning. So she didn't work a day and a half of every week, and so she couldn't be in as many scenes as Roma Downey could. So immediately, the supervising producer, who's in charge of scheduling, shut that down and said, no, we can't do it. And I thought, make me mad. I'm going to have to call my friend and say, you're going to hate this episode, don't watch it, right? And then I said, what if we asked Della? if this particular week she would work a couple of extra days for the chance to play this character instead of that character. And they're like, well, it can't hurt to ask. And you know, to not play a maid, she gave us another couple of extra days. So it was a move in the right direction, right? That had to be brought up. You have to think about it, then you have to talk people into it. Persuasive speech is a good class to take if you want to be a writer in a writer's room. This particular episode was called The House Divided. It didn't have Robin Williams in it. That's from which movie? Mrs. Doubtfire, right? Because I'd read an article about Mrs. Doubtfire. I wanted to do an episode about teaching parents not to make their child a weapon in their divorce, right? And because that's the story of divorce. It's like, you love me more than you love him. My problem was I knew that my boss's answer would be that parents, like the Parent Trap, should get married again at the end. That's the answer that our show should give. But I had read an interview with Robin Williams that had taken place several years earlier. When he agreed to do Mrs. Doubtfire, he put in his contract that the film could not end with he and Sally Field getting married again, because he would not lie to his own children, because he was divorced twice by then, and he knew he was never getting back together with his first wife. So he would not do a movie that lied to his own children. And that really struck me. So the way they fixed it was they made Sally Field already connected to Pierce Brosnan, right? That was the boyfriend, the husband. So as I'm thinking about this idea, I didn't pitch it for a while, because I knew the answer would be to marry them, and I didn't want to do that. And then one day, Mrs. Doubtfire was on TV, and I was watching it. It reminded me of the article, and I thought, oh, I will immediately pitch the story where the wife is already remarried, because the answer from Angels can't be get a second divorce and more to go, right? So that was my reasoning around why they didn't get back together. And when I pitched it, it worked, because I got the story I wanted and not the story that would have been molded from somebody else's opinion. It's hard when you're in a writer's room and you're not the head of it, because you are doing their show. It's what they want done, right? But you have to keep some of yourself inside there too, because that's the theme, that's the attitude, that's the voice that you're bringing to the story. So I couldn't pitch it until I knew that I could protect the full story the way I wanted it to come out. And this episode had a lot of lessons. I won't go into all of them. The first of which I lost, which was, again, a stereotype. It was going to be, well, first of all, I wanted to pitch a show. I'd read an article about a priest in LA who worked with gang kids who were also parents. And I wanted to do something where a boy had to pick whether he should be, oh look, it's a father episode, more devoted to the family he'd created or to the gang that was his fake family, right? He had to learn that the gang wasn't real, but his own family was real. I wanted to pitch that, but I knew that one of the other writers didn't like to do things with gangs. And I was like, well, that's stupid. That's writing out a whole sort of storyline. So I had to get my boss alone. And the boss on this show happened to be a female. And interestingly enough, there's one place that a girl writer could follow a female producer that none of the boys could follow us. The loo, ladies and gentlemen. So I waited until she went to the bathroom one day, right? And I followed her in. And while I was washing my hands very vigorously, I said, Martha, I've just read this marvelous article about this priest who works with gang boys. And I thought, what if we did an episode about a teenage gang dad? And she was like, oh, that's marvelous. We should do that. Let's talk about it. And we went back into the room where there were two guys I knew didn't want to do anything about gangs. And she pitched it. And they can't say no to the boss. So I got it. But now I had to deal with everybody else and their stereotypes. One of which was, oh, so the gang should clearly be black or Hispanic. And I was like, no, 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 we've done that too much. In my neighborhood, there were Armenian gangs at the time. Not that you want to pick on any one group, but you know, it was a new group that hadn't been picked on too much on TV. I argued for a good, solid 2 days in that room why it should be an Armenian gang. And I kept getting flack about, America doesn't understand that, they only understand these two groups, blah, 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 blah. And I was losing that battle. And one of the producers told me to shut up. And I kept talking, because I didn't want to lose that battle. Until finally, the person who usurped me was the casting director, who knew that was the storyline we were playing with. And he came in the room and he said, I don't have an Armenian actor who could be a guest star. But I have this guy, Renali Santiago, who had just done Hackers, Con Air, and, oh, the Michelle Pfeiffer movie where she's a teacher and she used to be in the military. Not standing, but, Dangerous Minds. He had just starred in all 3 of those movies, and he was willing to do a television episode. So the casting director came in and said, we got him, he's Hispanic, that's the gang. and I lost the argument based on the popularity of the guest actor they could get. So that was fine. Renly was marvelous, and we had a marvelous time working on that. A ton of other stories I can tell you about that. One of the things I learned was remembering the importance of words. The simple act of, in one scene, of course he gets shot, right, because he's in a gang. They had to go to the hospital. And all I had to do was write, the doctor walks in, and she says, and they hired a lady as the doctor. If I had not used that pronoun, they would have hired a man, because that's what an extra casting director would simply have gone to his stereotype. Doctors are boys, right? So just because of the word she, I got a woman a job, and little girls in America the chance to go, oh, doctors are girls, right? Now, y'all, as I said, did that better over here, right? Because that's very cool. But that's what Shonda Rhimes has built her whole career on, right? Colorblind casting and gender-blind casting. Let's just get in good actors to do these parts and see where we go from there, which I think is a really brilliant thing, and it's what she built her whole thing on. So, what I learned from being in a writer's room is the things you need to do most are the things you learn in English and humanities classes. First of all, you're selling your nightmares. What are the worst things you can imagine happening? Make stories out of that. They're the what-ifs of your life. That whole Down syndrome baby thing, I was pregnant when I wrote that. You have no idea when you're going to have a kid, right? Unless you get all the tests, and even if you get all the tests, you're not sure till the day the kid shows up. And you imagine all the awful things that might happen, right? So I was in the middle of that when I wrote that episode. So that was my true emotion that was happening. I wrote an episode once about what if your husband commits suicide. I wrote all kinds of episodes. I just thought, what are the worst things that could happen to me? And bam, they became episodes over and over again, right? So you've got to mine your nightmares and manage them. You have to always do research. You don't know everything, and you don't have to, but you have to be willing to look. I've got a whole lecture I do on the TV show Gidget from the 60s, that I discovered every episode written by a woman treated the Gidget character like a real human being. And every episode written by a male writer treated her like sort of a doofy, stupid girl. And I thought they didn't even go into reading the book that show was based on to understand her mentality. Her dad was a college professor, and she was studying literature in college. She's not a ditz, right? But they didn't even research that. So you have to really look into everything. You have to like research, right? That is something a writer must do. You have to speak up. Y'all were shy, I'll give you that, right? You don't know me, so it's a new thing. But you can't be shy in the room. If you don't open your mouth, what are they paying you for? You're only going to write 2 episodes of a TV show that runs 13 episodes. You get 2 a year. All those other episodes is you talking. What makes this one better for this writer? So we all keep employed next year. So you have to speak up. And I really say that to the girls a lot, because when I have my classes, often when I just open pitching up, anyone can start pitching their ideas, who's first. We'll go through a line of like 4 guys. And then I have to stop and go, does anyone notice anything odd right now? And I promise you, it will be a boy who says, none of the girls have pitched yet. The girls haven't even recognized that they are waiting their turn. No one will give you a turn. You have to take a turn, or you won't move as far as you like, as fast as you like. So speaking up is a big deal. And I hate to say it, but I learned how to cuss in a writer's room. Because sometimes that was the only way to get attention. If I threw out a good 4-letter word, all of a sudden everybody was looking at my section of the table, which doesn't make my mother very happy, but it was a silly thing, right? So you have to think about managing yourself and managing the other people that you are around. That's a big deal. What I hope you learn from me today is that a writer's room requires collaboration. It's always about sharing and talking with the other people to make the product better. And participation. You can't just sit in a corner. You have to be part of that conversation, or your perspective will not be included. And that's bad for you and anybody else who looks like you. It's your job to represent when you're in the room, so you need to be able to do that. Plus, I love this quote of Einstein's, imagination. You're selling your imagination. Who gets to do that? What job do you get to do that in, except writing? I think that is the coolest thing in the world. For me, teachers make good writers. Right? I obviously catered this to where I have come and been happy to be. I actually, whoa, went too fast. This was my Facebook post the other day. I don't like a lot of words on a screen, but I couldn't resist this, because I've never been to Oxford before. So I found this little church just off Wharton Road, where he was once a congregant, and I had to find the picture and send it back to my husband. And then the cat just found me, which I thought was cute. But seriously, I mean, how long has the guy been dead? And I'm still fascinated by the things he wrote. They still mean something to me and my family. Likewise, writers make good teachers. Flimming it around on you. And if you don't think novelists are writers who collaborate, think about the fact that all these guys hung around with each other in a writer's group and read stuff to each other and took notes from each other and made changes based on those notes. Those were writers' rooms. The Eagle and whatever that pub is called, which I haven't gotten to yet, Eagle and Child. That was a writer's room, right? And from that room, not only did we get those books, we got this collaboration. Phil Jackson is great. I love him. He's brilliant. He does great stuff. He doesn't do it alone. He's just the guy who's willing to do the interviews. His wife doesn't care to do interviews. I don't know what's wrong with her, but she's making me crazy, right? Because we're forgetting that two women co-wrote this movie. That's what makes it so much better for our times, right? They got the Best Adapted Screenplay Award. Two women and a guy made The Lord of the Rings into what it is. I think that's really important. So who remembers what I said my teaching philosophy was? 3 things matter. Words matter. Writers matter. And women writers matter. Thank you very much. See, you're listening. Listening is good. All right. And this is important to me. It's not just what I know. It's spreading that around. This is my first graduating class from Stevens. As I say, it was an all-female college. So it's about spreading the word. Writers are teachers with a giant podium. What's your opinion of how this world should work? Put it out there. And the bigger audience you get, the more influence you get. Forget YouTube and who does makeup well. Those aren't influencers. People who tell stories. Seriously, they're not. People who tell stories are influencers because stories teach us to feel. And that's what you get paid to do, which I love. So again, these are a bunch of books I used when I was just thinking about putting this together. So if you're interested in reading about showrunners, those are a bunch of books that do interviews with them. And of course, this is the bunch that I've written. And that's all I have to say. So I guess we're doing a Q&A now, right? So if people have questions, I am totally open to hearing things.